From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
Thank you, Chris. Happy Wednesday. Big one ahead. Now, let's get straight to it. You know that the High Court made the decision to release more than 80 people back into the community who were kept in detention because they had either committed crimes so bad that regular decisions were made that these were the wrong people to return to the community, or they were people who couldn't be sent back to the countries that either no longer existed or wouldn't take them. Now, amazingly, we've learnt via the ABC today that many of the people who were released last week as a result of this decision were released without visas into the community. Now, that is a decision that was made by this federal government. This federal government, this Home Affairs Minister, this Immigration Minister, who all failed to be able to deal with the release of some of these horrific human beings. A question that was asked today by the Shadow Immigration Minister to the Immigration Minister makes it very clear.
My question is to the Minister for Immigration. The ABC has just reported that following the High Court decision, the government released some of the 80 hardened criminals, which include murderers, rapists and child sex offenders, into the community without a visa. What? Is this true?
Yes or no question. But Adam Giles, the man who is, of course, the Immigration Minister, this is what he said.
I say again, complying with the orders of the High Court is not optional. It is incumbent on this government and on any government. All those who have been required by the decision of the court to be released have been placed on appropriate visas with appropriate conditions, and as I've outlined at some length in the chamber, there has been quite an extensive process of engagement with relevant law enforcement authorities.
I apologise, not Adam, he used to run the Northern Territory, Andrew Giles, the bloke who is far more concerned with a performance stance about imaginary examples of racism than he is about his core responsibility to keep people safe. His non-answer means the answer was that when some of these people were released into the community, they were released without the appropriate visas. Now, this issue is one that comes to the very heart of the lack of seriousness of the people who have some of the most serious jobs in the government. Claire O'Neill is, of course, the Home Affairs Minister. She is sitting in the job that Peter Dutton used to have. And even when the ABC is able to see a panicked moment in question time, because they thought, put it all on the court, nothing to do with us. Well, of course, the court is nothing to do with them, but the consequences of it absolutely is. Amazingly, she was in witness protection today. No questions were being asked of her because they know the Immigration Minister is the weaker political performer. But there weren't even questions from her own side to try to prop her up to give her the opportunity to say something about Peter Dutton and his time in the job as opposed to the decisions she has made in hers, which, among other things, of course, has been to bring back the ISIS brides who chose to leave this country to join, of course, a caliphate. Now, her and Giles can say as many times as they want that they argued against this in front of the High Court. But I want to show you the timeline of the proceedings in the High Court that shows that when one of two things can happen, the one that you don't want to happen, you need to be prepared for. Now, on the 6th of June is when the matter was referred to the full court of the High Court to make a decision. On September the 1st, this is all this year, not last year, not previous government, the written submissions were put in place by both the person who wanted to leave indefinite detention and the government saying that they shouldn't. There, of course, was the full hearings before the High Court, and then the decision was made last week. Now, the reality is that the failure of the government to plan for what to do in the eventuality of losing the case is the story. And the reality is that we've been told multiple things by this government about when they plan to plug the hole that has now been blown in our immigration system by the High Court, who's ruled that indefinite detention is illegal in the country. They told us earlier this week there could be no way they could come up with legislation to deal with this mess until maybe next year. Parliament is in its final beginnings swings of this year because, of course, they can't possibly work all the way through to late December like everyone else. No. Parliament gets its holidays even earlier than uni students. Now, the reporting from Philip Curry, who I would bet the house on in terms of what the government is planning to do just a couple of days ago, was that this won't get done until 2024. That your rage, our rage, and the pressure they're getting in question time led to leaks to The Guardian that this thing will happen sooner rather than later, and the follow-up leaks to the Sydney Morning Herald suggest it could happen as early as tomorrow. The Guardian Australia understands from two sources that internal government processes have been activated to approve the bill for urgent introduction to Parliament. Now, Parliament's been back since Monday. It should have been the first thing they did in Parliament the second it was back. But all of Monday, all of Tuesday, all of Wednesday and maybe Thursday before they start to come up with a solution here. Meantime, as this mess has been pushed out onto the communities of Australia, including even people in Yes Vote in Canberra who are concerned that a bloke who murdered his wife is now living amongst them. They've told us over and over again that the safety of the Australian people, it's paramount. It's all they care about.
But our first and only concern here is community safety.
There is one single focus and one single priority that we are using to manage the implications of the High Court's decision, and that is the community safety.
Our focus throughout, in anticipation of the decision and since it is on ensuring the safety of the Australian community.
The first priority of the government is to keep our community safe.
But the reality is they have failed. Why? Because they had no response. They let people go into the community without the appropriate visas. They have not had the legislation to plug this hole and told us that we'd have to wait until next year. Now they say maybe tomorrow. But you can't muck around with this stuff, and you have to plan for the eventuality of losing in the High Court. You can draft a piece of legislation, you can walk it into the Parliament, and you can do it first thing Monday. Instead, they are being dragged to this, and hopefully there'll be some sort of legal response to this in the next couple of days. But all that garbage about we care about the safety of the community, well, this couldn't have been handled worse. For people who came out of detention centres in Western Australia, they went to hotels in Perth. And the West Australian was smart enough to send a reporter to go and see exactly what was the conditions of these people who have been accused or convicted of horrific crimes. People who are not refugees, people who played the system like a fiddle. This excellent report I need to read in part to you now. Spending the night at the motel where 12 free detainees stayed until most of them were flown back to their families over east on Tuesday revealed how the group stayed up late boasting about smoking weed and talking about buying beer before they piled into cars to venture around Perth. Now, according to the law, they are free people, but according to the government, your safety matters. The reporter says, however, the Australian Border Force, the Western Australia Police, were nowhere to be seen on Monday. And Tuesday, as the group were left to freely explore a Perth suburb which is notorious for crime. With no police or security in sight, there was nothing stopping the criminals from walking, driving or hitching a ride away from the hotel. So I don't buy it. Do not buy the spin from the government that your safety matters. If your safety mattered, they would have found a way to have guards on these people until they were transported east or until the legislation could be moved into the Parliament to backfill this mess. But another thing that truly annoys me here, and I'm trying to do my best not to swear, but this is the toughest night I've had since I made that vow to myself. How many people are homeless in Australia right now? Do they have hotel-funded accommodation by the federal government? No, of course they don't. In fact, according to the most recent census, 122,500 people live on the streets. 122,500 people live on the streets. They are not given hotel accommodation by the federal government. They are not taken care of by the state government. They sleep rough every single night. And by all reports, that number is growing because that survey was done back in 2021. We, of course, had the effects of the pandemic into 22 and the cost of living fire that is raging in 2023. And again, my rage is reserved for those who speak such garbage in Canberra, but do nothing for good citizens of this country who are sleeping rough. An example of that person is somebody who moved from regional Queensland to southeast Queensland to try to find a job. He does not have a home because of the housing crisis that we have spoken about before. This bloke should have a chance of getting a job and finding a rental property. But as we've told you time and time again, report after report after report, there is nowhere for him to live. But there's places for this vermin to be put up in taxpayer-funded accommodation, free to come and go as they want. This is what this bloke had to say last night on Channel 9 in Queensland. Amazing.
For 2 months, David has been living in a small tent on the side of a Brisbane motorway.
I never thought it would ever happen, but it has.
He tells us he hates it when it rains because his tent leaks.
It's harder than living in a place, but it is somewhere safe.
No hotel room for him. A tarpaulin and half a tent by the side of the road. Oh, but your safety matters. Garbage. Now, Peter Dutton, who was always the steel in the spine of the former government and is now the steel in the spine of the opposition and the man who is showing leadership on how many fronts? He was right on industrial relations. He was right on the voice. He is right on this. He is right on the need to stand up to anti-Semitism, which is happening before our very own eyes. And he drew a line in the sand and he went hard today in Parliament. I loved it.
Not a chance, because this Prime Minister is as weak as water and the Australian public are working out what a fake and a fraud he and his government have turned out to be. Now, the Australian public at the moment know that they have got a government who has made every situation in their lives more difficult. We know that the cost of living pressures are putting enormous pressure on families because the government has made incompetent decisions in 2 budgets. We now know that in many parts of the country, Australians are suffering because of a crime crisis in their communities. We know that. How does this Prime Minister respond? He goes off overseas again. Prime Minister, don't leave this country until you have dealt with these issues. Don't hop on the plane again to the United States. You've just met with President Biden, an incredibly important relationship, but you've just met with the President. The first responsibility for you, Prime Minister, is to be here and take care of the Australian public.
Now, a clearly rattled, clearly annoyed Prime Minister being forced to confront the failures of his own administration and his own leadership gave one of the worst performances an Australian Prime Minister has in recent years. He couldn't fight on the issues. Instead, he tried to play the man and then, when all else fails, break glass in case of emergency, have a crack at Sky News prime time.
The opportunism of the Leader of the Opposition has been exposed for all to see here today. But I didn't think that he could go this low as to link these 2 issues, to try to link these 2 issues. And then he tries to link it as well with just to get another crack in the tabloids or to get a hear from Sky After Dark.
Seriously, this bloke is a fake. He is floundering in the job. He is most likely to be returned with a reduced majority at the next election. But when the pressure is applied to this bloke, he's got a glass jaw. You saw that he had his back against the wall today, and rather than defending himself, he turns around and turns it into the personal attack on Peter Dutton. Fine, that's politics. And then have a crack at the media that he doesn't like. The same media that his own government is trying to censor by limiting your ability to read or share it online. Oh, misinformation. No, it's about censoring the internet. Now, as we speak, this bloke is yet again overseas. By the time he gets back, he will have had enough time in the air to fly to the moon and beyond. But this bloke is not Buzz Lightyear. It is not about infinity and beyond. The press pack that have travelled with him have one task and one task only. Ask the bloke questions about the failures of his government, be whether his feet are on the ground in Australia, he's high in the air, or he's overseas. Because this is now a test of those reporters and the wider media. Will they just cover the fluff, or will they actually deal with a country that cares more about the comfort of people who shouldn't be in the country than the bloke who moves to southeast Queensland to get a job but ends up living by the side of the road? Which brings us to cost of living. The relentless focus we have to have because it is the pain that too many people feel right now. Survey after survey, poll after poll, month after month, it is crippling. But the Prime Minister says, again via the Financial Review, that Albanese tells voters budget surplus trumps relief. For his ability to go into the next election and say we're better than the other guys on economic management because we've got more money than we know how to spend, and by goodness do we know how to spend it. Anthony Albanese says his government's decision to safeguard the budget surplus, $20 billion by the way, is a key part of keeping inflation in check. What rubbish. In a signal to voters to not expect any more cost of living relief than what has already been the limited and targeted measures. Chief amongst them, petrol. I just had a look at the price checks in your state. It's basically $2 everywhere. But when the prices were $1.87 or $1.89, this bloke, when he was the opposition leader, said the sky's falling in, time to change the government. Well, what should we do with a government that's got $20 billion left over to make them look good politically, but they won't spend $3 billion of it to cut your petrol by 25 cents? Di Lee, the only person in federal parliament who raised a question this week about it. The only one. Meantime, the actual issues of cost of living. Now, they can be as dire as they are for that bloke by the side of the road in southeast Queensland, or they can be as pressured as they are in your house where you're watching us right now. And another survey comes out today to tell us that cost of living and its pressures are putting pressure on how cohesive our society is. That's before we even get into the race wars that are playing out on the streets, the both sidesism that comes out of the government, the failure to say anything about the hate preachers. We'll have a look at this and compare the current government and the former government and how you're going financially.
More Australians are struggling financially in 2023. The proportion of people who are satisfied with their finances, for example, has dropped to 61%. That's less than last year and significantly less than in the 2 years prior.
How much evidence do they need? But they think they can bluster and BS and change the subject and point at Peter Dutton and have a crack at Sky News, have a rip in to the Herald Sun, the Courier Mail, the Telegraph, the Tiser. Please. Now, there was good news today, because wages have, for the first time in a very long time, started to go up. They're going nowhere near beating inflation right now, which of course continues to go up. It has for the past couple of months. The expectations are it will go again. But the problem is, as wages grow, as does potentially inflation, all of which feeds right back into the problems that we talk about every damn night. One of the earliest actions of this government, which was cheered on by the business movement, the union movement and the media collectively, was this moment. It was the moment when the government decided to sign up to 43% reduction in emissions by 2030, but more importantly, to get us to more than 80% of the country to be powered by renewable energy. Now, all of this, of course, is costing trillions of dollars to move from the system that worked to the one that they, fingers crossed, hope will work into the future. And the reality is that you need to build this infrastructure, and that's what's costing billions of dollars, trillions of dollars with other infrastructure, and that's why you're paying more when it comes to your bills, because someone has to pay for it. Well, the sting in the tail on all of this is that, as we know, we're about to head into a particularly hot summer after we've been through a couple of wet summers. Now, we know that will include bushfires, but what it also means is that, according to the Bureau of Meteorology, when it's hotter, there's less wind. Can you see a potential problem here when part of the electricity solution is a wind farm?
We're likely to see less wind in the same parts of the country where a lot of electricity generation and transmission occurs. And obviously, from a wind generation point of view, particularly in the southern parts of Australia, we're likely to see decreased wind there, which will impact on the amount of wind activity that can come into the grid.
Now, he can mumble it and look down and hope that nobody was rolling a tape. We work, we look, we'll play it as often as we can. The reality is that as climate change does make the extremes hotter and colder and wetter and drier, if one of the solutions to our energy mix is something that requires the wind to blow, when it's going to be particularly hot, there's not going to be the wind. Which is why we heard today from, yet again, the people who oversee this multi-trillion-dollar transition, so the Prime Minister can look good when he bids for a UN climate conference in a couple of years' time. This bloke knows how to spend your money. $450 million on The Voice. How much money for UN officials to come here and tell us we're still not doing enough because we live in the first world? And we should send money to developing countries like China that continue to be the root cause of more than half of all of the CO2 pollution in the air every year? Well, again, let's turn to the taxpayer-funded version for the best possible spin on this story. This year's summer forecast for a hot and dry El Nino conditions increase the risk of bushfires and extreme heat, which could see electricity reach a 1 in 10 year high demand in the eastern states and in Western Australia. Since last summer, the network's bolstered somewhat by the addition of new batteries and wind and solar projects, which will help navigate reliability pressures, but there's still a risk of load shedding or rolling blackouts, where high demand coincides with scheduled maintenance at power plants or low solar and wind days. They have bet the farm on covering the farm with technology that is utterly dependent on the weather while the weather becomes more volatile. Yet China continues to win. They can pollute however much they want till 2030, and that's when they start to get measured. Their net zero isn't 2050, it's 2060. Yet we cover good agricultural land with solar panels that are often made back in China by slave labour. And if it's not a solar farm, it'll be a wind farm, and depending on the weather, that will determine whether the electricity system works. While we tip in more people with more demand, and the vicious cycle continues. Oh, but it's okay. The front end of the plane's all right. The CEOs are fine. The lobbyists are fine. The media's fine. But you have an anxious wait about whether or not you can even afford to turn on your air conditioner, let alone when you actually need it. Meantime, again, to the disgraceful use of other people's money, and I'm going to keep on about this one, which is happening in Queensland, where Anastasia Palaszczuk is hoping to go for a record 4th term in government. Now, she is the most successful female politician Australia's ever had, elected and re-elected multiple times because of the giant BS machine that is around her and the compliance of the local media. Well, as we told you this week, she is spending $393,000 of taxpayers' money for polling to be informing her of what decisions to make between now and the next election, because it's all about holding on to power. But the reality of her time in power has been problems at the hospitals, problems at the schools, ambulances, which I again repeat, if you're in regional Queensland, and I know there's more people that live in the southeast, and they're woker than ever before with more Greens eating into more seats in more places. But it is outrageous that when they've got $393,000 for polling, if you have a stroke in regional Queensland, there may or may not be the MRI machine to help work out how bad your stroke was in Queensland. If you call the ambulance and it's able to turn up because it's not being ramped at a hospital at record levels, in regional Queensland, the ambulance might turn up and the bloke or lady driving it as a paramedic, well, if they need to take care of you in the back, your partner will have to drive it because there's only one of them. Now, of course, they're going to poll all they want. And we've told you before about the changes to drug laws, which will see a statistical drop in the record of youth crime because 10% of all youth crime offences 12 months ago had to do with drugs. Drugs are now essentially put into the softly approach where they won't end up being recorded in the same way. So magically, youth crime will drop by 10%. Oh, the crimes will still keep happening that are fuelled by the people who rip stuff off to buy the drugs. But she'll have a number to be able to spin via her in-house polling organisation. But the Courier Mail, relentless as ever on this, and doesn't the government hate them for it, gave us a little bit of an idea about the heat map of crime that is all over Queensland. Let's have a look at this here. Now, of course, there have been rallies that have taken place. The Premier couldn't possibly attend those because, and I quote, she was at the Noosa Triathlon a couple of weeks ago. Priorities. Well, in North Brisbane, the most dangerous streets are Wickham and Brunswick streets. Why? Because there's been 361 assaults, 452 drug offences, 52 weapons incidents and 11 reported robberies and 2 arsons this year. South Brisbane, Anala Avenue is a significant problem there. 273 offences recorded in just those streets over the past year. 273 in 2 streets. 15 assaults, 14 unlawful entries, 6 robberies, 3 car thefts. Keep showing them here because it's worth seeing in Moreton, in Ipswich, on the Sunshine Coast and central Queensland. In Moreton, the most dangerous streets are Walter, Mortimer and Station streets near the train station. 12 assaults, 5 car thefts, 1 robbery. It goes on and on and on, but she will use your money to spin her way out. There is plenty to talk about on tonight's show. We shall do so straight after the break with Jenna Clark, who's also here with Keith Pitt. We'll get into this and a whole lot more issues. And the great Dave Rubin joins us towards the end of the show. We are more than 30 minutes away from the late debate, so let's make the most of our time together. More in a sec. All right, I calm down a bit. Now, as you know, it can get a little bit testy in the Australian Parliament. Question time can often become a little bit fiery. Prime Minister, you know, when break glass mentions Sky News, please. But of course we know there's plenty of fighting that happens in other parliaments and it's an excuse to show it. Like in Japan, who cares what they were debating and who cares whether we can understand it or not, but it's fun to watch. In Ukraine, before there was the little war, there was the war inside the parliament where this is the way they treat each other. Guy just gets yanked up and walked off. No doubt Keith Pitt's thought about doing that a couple of times when the Greens or the Teals are yammering away. I'd imagine a few people would like to fire up in the Senate, but they can't fire up as good as they do in Taiwan. How good's this when they rip into each other? I know it's serious. I don't know what. Who knows what they're debating? This could be the adjournment motion. I don't know what they were banging on about, but they're ripping in as hard as they can. Well, perfect example of parliamentary fighting comes to us from the United States. This is the most incredible footage you will see all day. It's a Senate hearing where a Republican senator has had enough of a hardcore union executive and they almost punch on. Have a look. And Bernie Sanders is the one stopping it.
Quit the tough guy act in these Senate hearings. You know where to find me. Any place, anytime, cowboy. Sir, this is a time, this is a place. If you want to run your mouth, we can be 2 consenting adults. We can finish it here.
Okay, that's fine. Perfect.
You want to do it now?
I'd love to do it right now.
Well, stand your butt up then.
You stand your butt up. Oh, hold on.
Big guy.
Oh, stop it.
Is that your solution, every problem?
No, sit down.
Oh, you're a clown.
Sit down.
Look at you.
You know, you're a United States Senator. Sit down.
Active.
Oh, okay.
Sit down, please.
All right.
Can I respond? Mr. Chairman?
Hold it. If we can, no, I have the mic.
said.
I'm sorry.
This is
Hold
what
it.
he said.
You'll have your time.
Okay.
Can I respond?
Oh, no, you can't. This is a hearing. And God knows the American people have enough of contempt for Congress. Let's not
I don't
make
like
it worse.
thugs and bullies.
And that's
I don't like you, because you
Hold
just
it.
described yourself.
Hold it. You have the mic.
Yeah.
You have time.
All right.
Make your statement.
Then let's do this, because I did challenge you and I accepted your challenge, and you went quiet.
No, I didn't go quiet.
Hold on.
No,
You challenged me to a cage match, acting like a 12-year-old schoolyard bully.
Excuse me. Hold it. No, excuse me.
I will say exactly.
Senator Mullen, I have the mic. You have questions on any economic issues, anything that say, go for it. We're not here to talk about physical abuse.
I just see Larry David every time I see Bernie Sanders now. But Keith Pitt, of course, they breed him tough in Queensland. I don't know whether you'd be that tough inside the parliament. And, of course, Jenna Clark, our friend here at Sky News, who wears yellow better than Hulk Hogan ever could. Lovely to see you both. All right, let's talk about what happened today in the parliament. I thought it was great to see Peter Dutton list a complete collection of failures and frustrations that people have. And we saw the Prime Minister, frankly, flounder, not find it a way to defend himself. Keith, as you were sitting there, what did you think, and particularly of the Prime Minister? Again, break glass in case of emergency, start going after the media. That's literally how little he had in his head as a way of responding to some pretty substantive questions that were being asked of him.
Oh, Paul, firstly, on your previous story, I mean, they say the Parliament's architecturally designed, but I think it's just that they bolt the furniture down. No one can pick it up and throw it around. But I mean, the Prime Minister, they might want to consider giving themselves an uppercut at the moment. But we've had Claire O'Neill in the Parliament today in question time and the MPI saying that, it's not our fault, it's the High Court. You are the government of the day. These are 80 criminals, one of which actually murdered someone and then blew their body up with gelignite in the jungle. Now, the Parliament's been here all week. You could have had interim legislation, things we could have worked with them over the weekend at 10 o'clock Monday morning, and we could have done something about this to protect the Australian people. And the answer has been obfuscation. What we've seen, mate, is an AFR story breaking earlier this evening. Apparently there's something to look at tomorrow. So I'm waiting to see that with great interest.
Well, this is the same organisation that was telling us we might have to wait till 2024, so that's an improvement. But Jenna, the reporting of your old newspaper, that being the West Australian, tells us they can tell us as much as they want that they were all about security and taking care of... Reality was... The ABC says some of these people came out without a visa. Other ones were taken off to the taxpayer-funded hotel, as we told you last night, all the welfare, all the rest of it, while the exact same scenario is not afforded to the homeless people of this country. It's disgusting.
Oh, it absolutely is, Paul. And I know my colleagues, Paige Taylor and Paul Garvey at The Australian, even spoke to one of those, criminals that is now out on the street, and he couldn't even explain. He basically said he was in prison for abusing an elderly woman and assaulting her in her home. And he basically said, I was just put in jail for fighting. So the fact that these people don't even comprehend at this point in time what the seriousness or the brevity of their crimes is really, really concerning. And the fact that I think I'm with Keith on this one, there should have been, and former Prime Minister Scott Morrison last night when he said right here on Sky News, they should have had legislation ready to go.
Absolutely.
Well, and instead the floundering, the carrying on and all the rest of it, right, which again, we showed you the timeline of their awareness of this as it was moving through the court. Right now, obviously, they, like all of us, had hoped that they got the win. They didn't, but that means the plan of action kicks in straight away. But clearly they didn't because their expectation was that this would be similar to the ISIS bride return. Oh, just a little thing that'll bubble away on the TV we don't watch and the paper we don't read. But the reality is this thing has gone bunter, and correctly so. Jenna, as the protesting has been happening all over the country and, of course, the world, there are various governments and oppositions that are trying to come up with ways to make sure that the most extreme versions of these protests or the people in them would be able to be removed from those protests. Suggestions are coming afoot, including from Victoria, that police should have greater rights to be able to move people on. So, OK, 1,000 people turn up, but you know what? The one holding up the sign saying put the Jews in the bin, that's the one you tell to move on.
Yeah, absolutely, and we saw it also in Coogee in Sydney as well, Paul. I think there was the guy waving the ISIS flag.
But they got a police escort.
Said, but Yeah, they got a police escort and was told, oh, excuse me, sir, please put your arms back inside the vehicle. So the fact that in Victoria, the Andrews government walked back these laws a few years ago, saying that, it impinged on peaceful protests and things like that, given the track record of how protests in Victoria have gone in recent months, I think it's about time that the opposition, they're due a win, so fingers crossed that this gets over the line during the party room meeting with the Victorian Coalition tomorrow.
Yeah, look, we'll see what happens, and certainly, obviously, the way that the upper house works there, that even if they tried to bring it in via the upper house, it's the Greens that end up with the numbers, so they're obviously not going to play ball there. But somebody making some clear efforts here, Keith, is what Australians are looking for. Again, I don't have a problem with people who want to march because family members or country men and women are dying. I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem with somebody who wants to hold up a sign saying that a particular race of people should no longer exist on planet Earth.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone's entitled to protest peacefully, just as the police are expected to enforce and maintain law and order. And the legislation needs to be in place to allow them to do that. And what's happened in Victoria, I think, is just an absolute joke. You spin this around, Paul, and make it a protest about something else. But we all know what happened in Victoria during COVID. And I thought a lot of that was just outrageous, what happened in Victoria during that period. And now you have people who are literally calling for someone to be killed, murdered, stuck in the bin. And that's okay. It is not okay. And this is a really difficult time for our country. It needs leadership, and I thought Peter Dutton was spot on today. And we need to make sure that the leaders of this country are in this country, delivering what's required for the Australian people, and to ensure that every Australian feels safe.
Now, we've seen in the ACT the drug parties that will no doubt turn up as people cross the border and realise that possession ain't a crime in that part of the world anymore. Whether the politicians will do so, we'll all find out in the next little while, hopefully not. But also in Queensland, we know the softly approach is in there, and even in New South Wales. That one went under the radar, but they're moving in this way. So the Greens, of course, are trying to steal a march from the legalised cannabis group, that cannabis should eventually be either decriminalised or fully legalised in the country, taxed and create billions of dollars of revenue. Now, what's interesting is that, as I said, at literally the New South Wales, Victoria and Western Australian Parliament have all got people elected on this very platform. Their votes are all needed to get things through in the upper house, with the exception of Western Australia, which means I think, whether we like it or not, this level of drug legalisation is going to be something discussed more actively in the next couple of years. Today, one of the former bosses of the AFP's turned around and suggested this is what should happen. Jenna, most people watching right now will say, hell no, but again, let's look at what is before us here. Do you think it's going to happen? Not whether it should or shouldn't, but do you think it's going to happen?
Yeah, look, I think it will eventually, Paul. I mean, we talk about the fact that the voting majority is going to move. It's younger and it's becoming more progressive as the years roll by. Whether we remain as progressive in our golden years remains to be seen. But I think it is really interesting when we've now seen the conversation being moved from without political realms being involved and experts, especially ex-coppers and things like that. I think people really pay attention. But I think the one thing to really look for is the fact that, like you mentioned in your editorial, when you decriminalise or you sort of move the goalposts when it comes to things like this, you're just really moving the pieces on the criminal balance sheet. It's still the crimes are still going to happen. It just the varying degrees of which they happen will be the biggest concern.
Well, and that's the thing, Keith, which is that people still need to pay to procure, be it legally or illegally. The way many are doing that is to commit crime. And again, you're going to see this in Queensland with the drug fiddle around, which again, they'll be able to say with all the taxpayer-funded polling, oh, we've reduced youth crime. No, all they do is they just don't count drug possession for kids anymore.
Well, I mean, I dislike this term progressive, Paul. Since when does progressive mean you can have half a dozen hits of ice or half a dozen hits of heroin, and you can actually be caught with no helmet on your scooter or your bicycle and get a bigger fine?
Good point.
It's just not right. It's not right for society. And even these alleged soft drugs, well, they still cause a lot of problems, particularly for mental health. I just don't support it.
All right, I'm with you. Thank you, guys. Do appreciate it. We'll talk again very, very soon. All right, quick break, back with more with Dave Rubin, a fellow Gen Xer who hopefully speaks the type of common sense you like to see. He joins us next. That time of the week to reach out to one of our favourite Gen Xers, none other than the great Dave Rubin from the free state of Florida. His show is called The Rubin Report, but you can see him each and every week with us. G'day, Dave. How are you, mate?
It is the fall in the free state of Florida. Well, is it the fall? It's the fall or the winter. I can't even tell because it's just sunny and beautiful and everyone's happy and free here. So it's all good, my friend. How you doing?
Now, today, massive protests in the United States, but they, for once, were in favour and support for Israel. What do you think of them?
Well, it was very heartening to see, you know, for the last couple of weeks since October 7th, we've seen a lot of rallies in support of, I would say, Hamas, not in support of the Palestinian people. They actually are in support of Hamas, and the rallies are calling for chants like River to the Sea, and as you had, unfortunately, in Australia, Gas the Jews, and we've seen this all across London and a bunch of other places, mostly in Western Europe. We've seen a little bit of it in the United States. So it was nice to see a rally today that was completely peaceful, where there were American flags, there were talk about shared values, there were talks about returning hostages and actually how perhaps one day there could be peace. There were no calls for violence or anything else like that. This is the type of protesting that in America we should see more of, where, you know, people are going to clean up after themselves. You know, it's going on right as we're recording this right now, but I just know that D.C. is not going to be left in shambles. They're not going to desecrate the White House or burn down any monuments or memorials or anything like that. And I think that tells you something pretty deep about what the fight here really is all about.
Yeah, it's really interesting how these protests are being presented to the American public. I couldn't help but notice that Rachel Maddow the other night on MSNBC, far lefty cable channel in the United States, she showed protests from here, there and everywhere when it came to the Palestinian cause, but wouldn't actually run things like this that were being said at those protests.
There's nothing higher nor more glorious than a martyr, and so we say glory to all the martyrs wherever they may be. Allahu Akbar. And the truth is, the Western world is alive. To the members of Congress, letting them know that they will be prosecuted in criminal courts.
Well, Paul, I'm glad you're also not making the distinction between quote-unquote pro-Palestine protests and Hamas protests. The simple truth is, if anyone went out there with a sign that said, I'm against Hamas, they would be treated just like if you brought out a sign that said, I'm for Israel. These are Hamas protests. What instigated this? It was the Hamas actions of killing 1,500 people and keeping 200 hostages and all of the rest of it. But you're right. The mainstream media runs cover, unfortunately, for these protests because they've wholly swallowed the narrative of the oppressed versus the oppressor, and they believe that Israel is the strong power and the Palestinians are this weak power. There's a gajillion historical reasons why this is inaccurate, and there's geopolitical reasons why it's inaccurate and everything else. But yes, there is a real problem here because we have people on our streets, and there's a bigger version of it in Europe than there is even in Australia and the United States. But as you correctly point out, it's sort of everywhere right now, where they're calling for Sharia. They're talking about the Muslim armies of the world to wake up. And as I've been trying to point out to people, you don't have to specifically care about the Jewish people any more than you care about watching Seinfeld. And you don't have to care about the land of Israel any more than you care about watching the Ten Commandments once a year. But if you think that the Jews don't have anything to do with Israel, well, then what do you think they are going to say about Americans in our land? What do you think they're going to say about guys like you and your viewers in the land of Australia? This is just the beginning of a much more nefarious project.
Let's talk politics. The New York Times keeps getting news out of one poll, but it's a big one. It shows Trump winning, and Trump even winning when there are three candidates in the race: himself, Joe Biden, and RFK Jr., who apparently has 25% of the vote. Do you think it's that high?
Well, Paul, we've discussed my feelings on polls in general, which, you know, there's definitely ways you can juice them, and it depends, you know, who's taking the polls and how they're asking the questions and all of those things. So I would, broadly speaking, I would take polls with a grain of salt. However, I would say it is very clear that RFK is doing something that is resonating with people in a very, very new way. He really is trying to find the disaffected Democrat as much as he is trying to find the disaffected Republican, and that is an awful lot of people right now. I don't think there's any evidence either way whether he would actually draw more away from, say, a Trump or a DeSantis or Biden. I don't think there's really any way of quantifying that. I can tell you, I did an event with him about 2 weeks ago in Los Angeles, a super enthusiastic crowd, and I started asking people, I literally walked out into the crowd after the event, and I started asking people, you know, which way do you usually vote? And it was everywhere. I mean, I'm telling you, it was half Republicans, it was half Democrats, it was half independents. Now, that's three halves, but it was a lot of people. I think you see my point. So something around what he is doing, calling out nonsense, particularly around COVID, particularly around the media and everything else. And, Paul, keep this in mind. Let's say he's not at 25%, but let's say he's even at 15, or even if it was 10%, that's an extraordinary number for an independent. And he's doing it while the media is completely ignoring him. So yes, the more they ignore him, the more I actually think something is going on there.
And big news today has been that the media have got their hands on a couple of tapes of Trump lawyers who were very much part of the events to try to overturn the election of 2020. They were in the room multiple times in the White House with Trump. They say he absolutely knew what was going on and that it was wrong. Well, they, of course, have now flipped and are now working for the prosecution against Trump in his January 6 case, among others. But those tapes happen to fall into the hands of the media. Now, we know this because every investigation into Trump is often via the media, but it was the judge's reaction who says that all of this might be witness intimidation, meaning they think it's Trump behind it. Now, why would that be the case when the videos are really bad for Trump and we know that the government has form here?
Yeah, well, that's a great point. And this has been going on across the board, mostly in Democrats' favor forever, right? They're constantly leaking, quote unquote, classified things to the New York Times, to the Washington Post, and everywhere else. So the way they leak seems to always go in one direction. I would say, broadly speaking, related to Trump and these trials and everything else, we know this. The more they go after him for these things, no matter who turns on him, no matter who says, oh, I know about these classified documents, or he said this to me, or he said, actually, we don't know that there was any way that they stole the election. I'm just not going to leave office, or whatever else. The base never moves. This is just a fact that is now baked into American politics. The base simply does not move. I think there's many, many reasons for that. A lot of the reasons are actually completely legit. They feel like he's being treated unfairly. And so even if 9 out of 10 things that they try to get Trump on are wrong, one happens to be right, they're willing to skip on the one. And I think that's a legitimate psychological response to a lot of what's going on with Trump. So I sense that he is not going to get out of any of this as the next year rolls by and we get into this next election. And it is very likely we will have a president, well, not only under indictment, which he currently is, but we could have a president seriously hung up with legal problems when he's in office, if that's even possible. I mean, we're totally in uncharted waters here. That's the point.
Thank you, mate. We'll see you again next week.
Good to see you, my friend.
Dave Rubin in the United States. And speaking of, some big news about one of my favourite cities over there, Las Vegas and rugby league. Next. I love rugby league, I love Las Vegas, and both will be there together in March of next year. Here's how it is being sold to the Americans. Oh, but before we get there, Grand Prix this weekend.
Along straight here, they'll race around the Sphere, which is this fascinating new building, new to Las Vegas since I've last been there. And then eventually come to Las Vegas Boulevard itself. The pace of the cars as they come down here, as they come down to where you are, Vicky, and actually arrive at the Bellagio Fountain and Paris and New York down there, will be in excess of 200 miles an hour.
Or 321 kilometres. Watch it all on Fox Sports this weekend.